As this is the book report, bear in mind there will be spoilers involved in this. Proceed at your own caution. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Steps Basic, and welcome to the Scarlet Letter Book Report. So, little things to get out of the way first. This is my first book report, and I wanted to make sure you all understand that this is going to be audio only, so you're going to, much like the rest of the stuff is, but I am recording it visually, so if you wanted to see my pretty little face, it is here. Just, anyway, let me know if you want me to do it in that format or this format, but this whole channel is dedicated to basically something you can put on and listen to in the background without having to worry too much about anything else. As such, like I said, audio only. I have yet to really settle on what I want to do for backgrounds yet, but, it'll happen. It'll work out how it wants to. So anyway, The Scarlet Letter. I just finished reading this book, and I have to say that it is, without a doubt, a true American classic. That being said, it is a difficult book to approach, and I'm not just talking about the subject matter. To say I was looking forward to reading this book out loud and for an audience troubled me would be an understatement. A lot of us have a memory of trying to do that in high school, whether it's your teacher calling on you in the middle of class or you need to come up and present the chapter, blah, blah, blah. You remember high school and how much it sucked. Yet, that was also why I chose this to be my first true audiobook. You see, underneath Hawthorne's gratuitous use of alliteration and his tendency to focus on the minutiae, there was a story that was worth telling. More importantly, there was a story that needed to be told. Let's address first the setting. Our story's setting is a fairly interesting one. On the surface level, it is simply a story set in colonial Massachusetts, which, fair, but it doesn't end there. Rather, I should say it doesn't begin there. You see, the Custom House, the rather lengthy and dry preface to the novel, sets the story in post-revolutionary days, maybe less than 100 years in the future. Their future, not ours, obviously. But anyway, there are no true dates used throughout, so we have no other choice but to base them on dates close to the publishing date. Unless, of course, I've forgotten, which is quite possible. They may have used dates at some point and I just forgot. But anyway, a generous guess would place the time difference between Hawthorne's place and Surveyor Pugh's at between 40 and 75 years. And yes, I said Surveyor Pugh, not Hester Prynne, for that is another interesting point of the setting of the story. Well, not the setting entirely, rather the source, though the setting is a part of that as well. You see, the line goes, it starts with Nathaniel, or the narrator, and he's telling the story that he read about in his position's former holder's notes. That's a bit of a fun little connection there. His position, the former holder of the position left notes behind, and that former holder was Surveyor Pugh, who, by the way, was not in that position at the time of the events of Hester's life. So he was also not a first-hand witness. So we are arguably 2 generations removed by the narrator's point of view. When you factor in Hawthorne's opinion regarding the events in Hester's life, we get an interesting view of the passage of time. What was standard and normal for Hester was already strange and outdated by the time Hawthorne saw it, and even more egregious to us in the modern day. This ideal makes the story's setting just as important to the story as its characters. Now we can talk about the characters, and to say that the setting was a character in and of itself is a little obtuse. Sure, it helps to accentuate the story by establishing that it comes from what is, especially now, a backwards era. But the narrator, now there is no doubting that he is indeed a character within the story. The story is placing the narrator as the interpreter, not as a faceless first-hand source or even a second. Rather, the narrator is twice removed, telling a story he is interpreting from a story interpreted by another. This, in many ways, influences the story itself, from how he describes the times to the many fantastical magical traits that he attributes to Little Pearl and others within the world he is sharing. In many cases, I tend to not like including narrators as characters in stories, as they are mostly just stand-ins for the audience. Yet, when they contribute to the story in ways, even so subtle as Hawthorne's narrator, it is impossible to separate them. But after we address the narrator, think of him as a character, we look at the next character. But the next character that we meet is not what I would say a typical character. More, it's a group rather than a singular person. And while there are a few individual sub-characters within this group, they are basically just an emotion within the character itself. And that character is the townspeople. Nothing quite like a glance at the Puritans from a far-removed future, am I right? But anyway, it is funny how we in modern day like to remark about how our forefathers came to the New World in search of religious freedom, and then we realize it was just that they thought the Church of England wasn't strict enough. Now, forgive me, I'm just a historian, so I might be wrong. I'm just a silly guy with a love of stories, but hey, it is what it be. Regardless, the character of the townspeople acts as a secondary antagonist to our main cast. While they are truly the first we meet, their impact is slightly lessened as they grow as people. One thing I think is interesting about passing off an entire town as a singular character is just how apropos it is to liken it to a human mind. We as singular beings, you and I, and of course the other people who may be watching this, suffer under many different emotions fighting for dominance in our heads. So a little cognitive dissonance and suddenly our entire worldview is standing on its head. Now obviously they need to hate our leading lady for her transgression. But then it turns out that this stranger in their midst is not such a bad person after all. At many times, the narrator will point out what Hester did for the people. Then, at just as many points, he shows how they shun her. Even the poor and downtrodden, starving or freezing in the streets, turn their noses up at her. Her source of ignominy drive them to shun her. Yet, it did it again, didn't it? Ignominy. Her source of ignominy. I hated that word while I was reading the book, by the way, and I hate it even more after I edited it. Her source of ignominy, driving them to shun her. Don't ask me why I included it in my book report, but, shut up. Anyway, where was I? But yes. Her source of ignominy, driving them to shun her. Yet, when more people come to town, they view her as though she is some high-class woman. Even by the end, none of them truly know what the letter on her chest meant, fancying that it meant Abel or angel even, though the latter is never outright said about her letter. This leads us comfortably, I would say, to Hester Prynne herself, our heroine who stands defiantly before the townspeople as she is shamed for a transgression the narrator belays naming. From moment one, we know Hester is a strong woman. She even remarks to herself how easy it would be to laugh in the faces of those condemning her. And yet, she's human. I know that in the modern day, we have a lot of annoying arguing about strong women in media, and while I won't weigh in too much, save to say that the world has always and should always have strong representation of women in the arts, I will say that the strongest built character, whether man or woman, needs to be human. As such, our Hester passes the mustard. She stands defiantly, but then balks when she realizes that the townspeople aren't mocking her. They just silently judge her. Despite her earlier plans of smiling derisively at them, she is struck by the power of their judgment. Rather than crumbling under its weight, though, she finds solace. Hester bolsters herself with memories of her past life. This sets the tone for how she will be. Even when presented with hardships and challenges, she will eventually rise above them. Even when she doubts herself, she will keep moving. Even when they hate her, Hester will still be good and kind to the people around her. In many ways, Hester shows how godly she is. In the puritanical days of colonial Massachusetts, it was not unheard of for a man to be punished with death for the transgressions of their ways. Hester knows this, and knows that if she were to name the man she loves, his punishment would be much more final than her own. She could live under the scrutiny of that town, under the pressure of the Scarlet Letter, so long as she knew the man that she loved was safe from harm. He wasn't, though, was he? Our third character makes his way onto the scene. Old Roger Chillingworth, as he is to be known, as the narrator doesn't know or just doesn't give his name. But who is this deformed old sawbones? He is Hester's true husband. As though some small measure of pity, he allows the world to believe him dead. Hester is permitted life without his direct influence. He wouldn't be much of an antagonist if that were the end of it, though. No, Roger Chillingworth, despite admitting his failures with Hester, commits another more egregious failure of his own. He dedicates himself to finding out who is the one who led Hester astray. As a character, Roger is possibly the most dynamic, as I tried to portray in my voicing of him, starting out with a more godly, I am Roger Chillingworth, and ending with a more decrepit, dying voice as he's passing and bitter. But, like I said, he's the most dynamic. He starts out simple enough. A man returning to find out his wife had an affair. He forgives her. He pretends to be dead, and then he assumes the mantle of Roger Chillingworth. Everyday things. But throughout the story, we watch as the want of revenge slowly destroys the old fool. A lesson we can all stand to learn. Forgiveness isn't for the one who wronged us, but for ourselves. So if Roger decided that Hester wasn't his target, obviously he was going to turn his attention to her co-conspirator. That leads us to our next character, the Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale. At first appearance, and many subsequent ones, Arthur seems as a very weak man. Of course, only physically. The narrator goes to great length to describe how Arthur's health is failing him. In many ways, this is because of his hidden strength. Unfortunately, strength is a finite resource. One thing I find interesting about Arthur is the misinterpretations I have seen about him. Even in the blurb on the back of the book I read, he was described as Hester's cowardly lover. I stand against this slander on many bits of solid ground. The only important foundation we need to lay here is that he struggled to maintain his anonymity for Hester's sake. No doubt at her bidding, even. The book even shows this at several points, the most important one being when he pled with her on the scaffold to reveal the name of her lover. He was asking that he would stand next to her, and yet she refused him. This led him to 7 long years of living a lie for the sake of the woman he loved. Some could, in many ways, see the next character as another antagonist. The narrator seemingly goes to great length to put this idea in our heads. But no. Even, and especially in the context of the story, little Pearl was an innocent child doing her best to understand the world that she was raised in. Pearl is often compared to supernatural beings and to the Scarlet Letter itself, as a punishment or reinforcement of Hester's ignominy. But anyone who has spent any time with a toddler can assure you that she is acting just like a normal kid. Maybe she was a bit unruly for her time, but in no way was she supernatural. But even her classification as some demon child lends itself to the themes of this story. The funny part is, there were quite a few themes in the Scarlet Letter. Luckily for me, they were very few that were hidden far below the surface. Admittedly, I can be a little dense unless it's actually beat into my head sometimes. But anyway, I'd say the more predominant of them all was, of course, fidelity. Fidelity in a Puritan colony. Fidelity in a Puritan colony, sure, but fidelity nonetheless. The very source of Hester's mark was, I would say she and the Reverend went to Sheboygan, but I don't know how many people would get that joke. They had an affair. It was quite scandalous. However, in their defense, she did think her husband was dead. This wasn't actually mentioned in the book, per se. For those who've seen the 95 Demi Moore and Gary Oldman movie, this was a direct plot point. But in the book, it was just referenced. Old Roger tells Hester to let people continue to believe he was dead, while he assumed the role of town doctor. However, she was still married at the time of the event, and their sinful act had led to the birth of a child. Not really something they can easily hide anymore. One interesting point about Hawthorne's approach to this topic, possibly a good note to most authors, I'd say, Hawthorne didn't once use the word adultery in the novel. It is what we, the audience, understand the A on her chest to mean, but is never outright stated. There are many times in the book that it is referenced, don't get me wrong, in much the same way I mentioned Sheboygan earlier, obtusely, not quite direct, but, Anyway, however, what is adultery without the attached sin? Which is the second most prevalent theme in this story. That and Christianity. Sin and Christianity. Yeah, it's fine. Anyway, the Reverend struggling with his faith, as he knows he has violated his oath and sacrament, is far too easy to point out as an indicator of the religious themes in this book. Even the inclusion of a reverend as a main character is heavily weighing the idea. But everything, from the setting to the townspeople to even the narrator's proclivity for assigning demonic origins to Pearl, are the indicators. This was a common theme in post-revolutionary writing. Man versus God, if you will. The narrator, while not openly stated as an atheist, occasionally discusses the failures of the Puritans. Of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that Hawthorne's narrator was an atheist. I myself am religious, but I have no issue pointing out the failures of man's interpretation of religion. By puritanical standards, though, he, as well as I, would fall easily into the heretic category. This makes it even more painful watching Hester suffer under this yoke. She does her best to be a godly woman, living by the standards of their religion. She even goes above and beyond to provide more care to others, turning the proverbial cheek when looked down upon. And even in the end, as she holds her man, she asks, "Shall we not spend our immortal lives together? Surely, surely we have ransomed one another for all this woe." This shows how she has not given up hope, that she has returned to God's grace. My opinion is, as it always has been, that it is not a sin worth eternal damnation. True, it is of great import, but is not one to so easily drop you into hell for. One that I think is far heavier a price is the theme old Roger Chillingworth brought forth, the sin of wrath. Through his single-minded determination to ruin Arthur Dimmesdale, Roger condemned his own soul. At that point, he displayed one of my fundamental issues with the theme of revenge. It requires your characters to be stupid. I can understand an instant losing your cool, lashing out, etc. But Roger simmered and seethed for 7 long years in his dedication to wreak vengeance. True, though, he accepted that he was giving up his life, both literally and metaphorically. As he adopted the name In the Cell in Chapter 3, so was he sacrificing all that was his former and true self. Thus it was that the man did the most profoundly stupid thing. The sin he forgave Hester for and blamed on himself, he found as unforgivable in the other man. A further testament to just how correct Hester was in not allowing Arthur to out himself, I suppose. But anyway, let's move on to my opinion. With all the structure, story, and important bits aside, all that remains is my opinion. In truth, I must suggest you read this book. If you are, like me, and suffered the trauma of reading it for school, give it another chance. It is much better when you aren't forced to read it. I can't in all honesty give it full marks, as it is a product of its time. There are numerous issues with the structure, various outdated ideals, and yes, despite his progressive stance in the future, in regards to the story of course, there are still numerous bits of racism. Despite all of this, this book falls into a box I never thought I would find myself recommending. For the longest time, I stood pretty staunchly in a place of it doesn't matter if the message is good, the story has to be entertaining, or no one will read it, which put me at odds with a lot of written works. While I do still agree with that idea, I think now, especially as I'm getting older, we can and should extend a long olive branch to works of the past. For its day, I'm sure The Scarlet Letter would have found itself more in place. But these days it is a far more awkward read. Hawthorne's tendency to use alliteration is off-putting, especially when trying to read out loud. He focuses on too many details. The Custom House preface is a prime example of that. He takes almost 50 pages just to say one or two important things. Anyway, but in the end, The Scarlet Letter is an important story. It shows the passage of time, the progress of civilization, and gives us a window into the past, which in and of itself is a window to a further past. So I suppose, if I must, I will assign an arbitrary number of 4.375 out of 5. It's definitely better than average and still holds up to this day. But anyway, there you have it. That is my book report for The Scarlet Letter. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, thank you. If you'd like to, you want to discuss some points down in the comment section, I will be reading them as well as I can and try to keep up. But apart from all that, thank you, and farewell.